me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Cello Chat. This one, another very special one. Every so often, we have somebody on Cello Chat who is not a cellist per se, but as a violist, I think, and again, violists who play the Bach cello suites, and who are kindred spirits in string quartet playing, et cetera, et cetera. You're practically just playing a small cello anyway.
Fair enough. That's how we like to think of it for sure.
All right. So Edward Klorman is on the faculty at UW-Madison. Ed, it's really great to have you on the program today. I hope you're doing well.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So, one of the main reasons why we're talking today is about your book that was just released this
Mhm.
year on the Bach cello suites. And I got to tell you, I have a lot of questions for you about these incredible contributions to the cello repertoire. But first, a tradition, I want my listeners to know more about you.
Sure.
And it's just fun to hear about how people got started on their instrument. So if you wouldn't mind, how did you get started on the viola? And then briefly your educational path that took you to where you are now, and then of course what got you interested in this project that led to this book.
Absolutely. Well, as a kid, I started off on violin, like many people do, and I was sort of curious also about composition. I was fortunate to grow up in Rochester, New York, just down the street from Eastman School of Music, and so they have a wonderful community school that offered theory classes and some composition lessons. I sort of developed as a performer late. It wasn't really till around high school that I switched from violin to viola and started taking my instrument more seriously. I had a friend in high school, Jonathan Vinocour, who was a very talented violist. He's now the principal of the San Francisco Symphony. So it was very inspiring to be around him, and ended up studying with his teacher, and things sort of developed from there. She was the one who got me curious about the Bach cello suite, which I'd never heard of before. Although I guess as a Suzuki violinist, you play a few movements that are arranged from the cello suite, so that's many people's first introduction to them, even if they're not familiar with where they originate. Um, but yeah, while I was in high school, I was definitely interested in learning more than just my instrument. So learning about the repertoire broadly, analyzing music, learning about its history. I ended up spending my undergraduate at the Juilliard School, where I had the good fortune to study with Heidi Castleman, who's a wonderful viola pedagogue. But while I was there, I remained quite interested in music analysis. I had this instinct that a lot of what we do in string quartet rehearsal has a quality that's a little like analysis, thinking about how parts fit together or how you shape a piece of music in performance. Um, and then I took sort of a bit of a detour. My next step after my viola performance undergraduate was an MA PhD program in music theory and analysis. I did that at the City University of New York. So I stayed in New York for that. That's a school where Carl Schachter had taught for a long time. And he's somebody who made a big impression on me as an analyst who thought about music in, I was about to say in very musical ways. What do I mean by that? In ways that were oriented toward narrative or listening in ways that you might shape in performance. I often felt this kind of code switching where I'd use kind of one kind of language when I'd be talking to, my performer colleagues, and a different kind of language that I had to learn when I was talking to academics who do research and focus on journals and whatever that might be. Maybe that's familiar to you too with your background. Um, and I ended up writing a thesis that became my first book. That book is called Mozart's Music of Friends, Social Interplay in the Chamber Works. And so that book is about how do the different instruments interact with each other in a chamber piece with a focus on Mozart's chamber music. So, yeah, I'm familiar with this tradition of comparing chamber music to being like a conversation. It occurred to me that that means that different instruments could take the role of different characters who sometimes work together, but sometimes oppose one another or surprise one another, or maybe some of these surprises are in there in the music for us to discover as we're playing the music through. So I was curious really to try to bring what I knew as a music historian and analyst into contact with other things I knew kind of in my fingers as a player. So that was very much my task in that book. Was the first time I felt I'd kind of bridged those two languages. So that's a little bit about my educational trajectory.
Wow, wow, that is really awesome. I have a number of reactions and thoughts even there.
Yeah.
I mean, like the viola roll. I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, I really love the viola. I tried
Mm,
to talk both my boys into picking up the viola, and there's a number of times when if people just look at what the viola line is in a string quartet or in a symphony or something, it's this beautiful counter melody that just is fascinating, and it so often is the essential glue between the melodic, the treble clef stuff and the bass line. So I can see how that would lead you to thinking, wait, I'm playing this role. I have like people who always play a treble clef instrument. Often they're drawn to the melody, the melodic
mhm,
aspects, and they have to go, oh yeah, but I need to study the Roman numerals under it or something like that.
mhm,
And then likewise, bassline creatures, tend to be all about the bass line more often and the harmonic underpinnings. At any rate, my own experience too, I was a performer first, and then found there were a number of the master classes that I would go out of my way to see where they weren't talking about nitty-gritty technical cello stuff. They were talking about the large scale phrasing and in some cases, even if they weren't Schenkerians, once you learn Schenkerian analysis, you find out, well, they're talking about the architecture
mhm,
of the scale degrees on which everything else is based. And that's funny because it makes me, the way that you were talking about having to use two different languages, there are
mhm,
a number of times where if you use the Schenkerian term, a musician will just kind of blink at you a couple times. And so then you just take that concept and you use different words, and now they're on board, even though they think in terms of Schenkerian analysis. You have to do this translation, but it's the same. Frankly, I'm kind of used to the translation. I feel I have to do the same way of thinking in different terms. Frankly, when I take my cello to my luthier, they don't.
mhm.
It's like when you use a word about the particular thing that you're wanting from your string, and they'll look at you like this and they'll furrow their brows and they'll use different words. And you go, okay, yes, that's what you mean when you're talking about. Have you found that too when you take your viola to the shop?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm reminded of when you talk about that is, the cliche about the way maybe a sommelier will talk about wine using these adjectives that how do we describe the ineffable? And so, of course, people who study music, we invent a lot of vocabulary so we can be more precise. Maybe it's similar, the way patients talk about their experience with their bodies versus the way doctors talk about it too. So it's not
Yeah.
surprising that people who write books and articles and this sort of thing have invented a whole vocabulary that can be highly specific and technical, and that can be removed from the listening experience or the playing experience. Certainly, when I go from teaching to writing, depending on whom I'm speaking with, we all use different sorts of language. I'm sure we all do that with our teaching with different kinds of students too.
Right, right. And then
Mhm.
back to like what you were talking about with Schachter's music sense.
Mhm.
I can't help but think about how so much of early attempts at music analysis were based on language analysis, rhetoric.
Mhm.
And there are ways in which I think somebody could do a 21st century version of that by by not just making this metaphor to music being like a language. It is a language. It's just an
Mhm.
incredibly different one from the written and spoken ones. But you could still talk about these forces in music being having a rhetorical purpose, you
Yeah,
know.
one thing that was super interesting for me when I was researching what turned into my first book is I just know from playing many, many string quartets the experience of the first violin has this and I play off of it. And then suddenly I'm with the cello. And then the cello has a G sharp and I was expecting G natural and that the violin has to respond in a certain way. This is something we all know in our fingers and in our ears, in our guts. And it was really exciting to me to find musicians in the 18th century where there's little hints of them describing something similar. So, for instance, there's this music theorist who was a contemporary of Mozart named Heinrich Christoph Koch. And he has this
Yeah.
footnote about, well, what does polyphonic versus homophonic mean? And he says, a homophonic piece expresses the sentiments of exactly one individual person. So therefore, the melody is that individual, and it's supported by what he calls a Grundstimme, which means something like a bass part, a supporting part. Whereas a polyphonic piece, by which he means a piece like most string quartets, all the instruments, it represents the sentiments of exactly as many people as there are main parts. And he considers every part to be one of those main parts. So that's very interesting to me to find a musician writing and thinking during Mozart's lifetime who's describing something like this thing I know centuries later from just having played and listened to some of the same music.
Yeah, I think he's one of the most underrated theorists. You know, the way he talks about taking one phrase and then, okay, now make it an incomplete cadence and then a complete, and now you've got your period. And now separate that and put, I mean, it's like he evolves the idea of a composition in a kind of an organic way, like you'd almost diagram a sentence or even create something like a movie plot or screenplay or something in a way that I think was ahead of its time, really
Yeah, I mean,
profound.
I know his is not a name that will be familiar to all of your listeners, but I have the same experience reading Heinrich Christoph Koch's writings that he describes things that a lot of composers were doing, but no one before had put into words. And then as I listen to Haydn or listen to Mozart after having read it, I notice it just tells me how perceptive he was writing about things that were really brand new as he was writing about it.
Right, right. Like Rosen's book on the phrase and or Rothstein and how it got looked at differently in the 18th century versus the 19th century. It's like that's all in Coke.
Hmm. Yeah,
But in,
absolutely.
fun stuff. So actually, let's see. Let's use this as a springboard, a bouncing off point to talk about a couple of things. One of them being the Bach cello suites were viewed not as concert hall pieces, but as more like etudes for quite a while. And I'm going to say something I hope this isn't too controversial, but it's like even though I of course support them being played on stage, and I do very often, there's an etude quality to them. I mean, it's like what better repertoire to learn smooth string crossings on than the Bach suites, and there's certain things about, let's say, extensions and small shifts that one has to navigate in the E flat major prelude, the fourth suite. That I mean, it's like I can't find a better etude for teaching these sorts of things. So I mean, to a certain extent, the people who called them etudes weren't wrong in their technical pedagogical usefulness as well. So, I mean, what do you think about that statement?
I think that's totally fair. One of the themes in my book is that every generation has remade the Bach suites sort of in their own image. So the way we think of them now, people will think that was we were overlooking something some decades from now, I'm sure. So, many, many collections by Bach have this quality that Christoph Wolff describes as an opus character, meaning it's a collection that strives to encyclopedically show the possibilities given certain parameters. So if it's the art of the fugue, it's what's everything you can do using these fugal techniques with this particular subject. If it's the well-tempered clavier, it's, well, let's exhaustively go through every major and minor key. And while we're doing that, we'll learn all kinds of keyboard techniques, different styles of preludes, different fugal techniques. So the Bach cello suites are certainly something like that. One has to think of Bach at this time, at the time he wrote them in Köthen, in the 17 teens, probably completing them around 1720, we think, as a composer who was most at home as an organist and a keyboard player, who seems to have more or less taught himself violin to a very high level. But we don't really know, did he play any kind of cello? There were a variety of instruments in his lifetime that were called cello. There's people who speculate the instrument called violoncello da spalla, that's the very big one
Right.
you play like this. Some folks describe that as a type of cello. So, it's not impossible that could have been what he had in mind for the cello. We just don't know.
Right.
But certainly one has the sense that he was exploring the capacities of this instrument as he composed the suites. Unlike the violin sonatas and partitas, the six suites are approximately in order of technical complexity, I would say.
Hmm.
Um, One imagines, the prelude to the G major suite as sort of introducing the instrument in its most natural form, showcasing each of its open strings, for example. We have the fermata on the low C, we have the variolage on the high A, on the open A string, and so on. So over the course of the suites, you certainly develop different ways of using the instrument and develop different skills, just as you say. The only thing I'd add is um, the idea of music that's teaching you how to compose and how to use your instrument might be a little different than maybe a 19th century conception of etudes that are for execution as
Sure.
opposed to concert etudes. So the very first edition of the cello suites was published about a century after Bach composed them. This was in Paris, I think it's 1824. And if I'm remembering correctly, the title is Etudes or Sonatas, something like that. The preface describes them as saying, we finally have this publication from Bach that, together with his keyboard fugues and his violin sonatas and partitas, now we have a complete school for the three principal instruments of modern music. So the whoever wrote that editorial preface, it's not totally clear, was pitching this to a customer who would buy them as etudes to learn your instrument rather than as concert music. And so then it's interesting to think about, how did this music change? You can think about this with many genres when it goes from one setting into the concert hall. When German art song moved from your home into a concert hall, when the string quartet, which was originally played by friends for their own enjoyment, moved into the concert hall. How does the repertoire change, and how do listeners have to change? Is part of the history of these pieces.
Yeah, yeah, very good points. Let's see. So in writing, let's see, composition practice at the time, it was, these days we have orchestration will be a class, for example. You
Mhm.
learn how to take often four parts, maybe three, and turn them into a whole bunch of parts. But back then, the idea of just kind of increasing or decreasing, reducing or increasing number of parts. Um, so like to take something that was for four voices and reduce it down to one voice
Right.
is something that you'd find, for example, under the heading of compound melody. And da da
Mhm.
dun da da dun dun da, and
Mhm.
okay, well, when this person's resting, we're going to go down and move this person's part, everything. And it's interesting how I think that is it's a little bit foreign to modern listeners to think about things being reduced so much. This idea of economy. Oh, we don't need a whole symphony to say what we're going to say. We're going to say it with a string quartet. Oh, wait, I kept going. I've got one person out there
Mhm.
on stage who's just covering. Where's the rest of the band? No, 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 no. This is it. And it's interesting to sometimes to see people's reactions to unaccompanied music in general. And then it's also then once they kind of love the Bach suites and put it on a pedestal, then it's blasphemy to them that a variety of composers have come along and dared to put piano parts to
Right.
them. But it's like Bach, I don't think would have, there's no way he's turning over in his grave because it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of just turning it back into, let's say, a four voice texture or something like that.
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
we know from his student, he had a student named Agricola who wrote about how Bach used to often play the violin sonatas and partitas at the keyboard, fleshing out the harmony as much as he saw fit. And there are versions of those written out in arrangements for keyboard that come from Bach's circle. We don't know if Bach was involved with making them, but they're in the handwriting of his students. We don't know if he did this with the cello suites. But for example, the copyist of what we know as Source B, so that's Peter Kellner, he was an organist who played a little violin, but not much, and probably no cello. His copy seems to have been made for his own reference for playing or teaching on keyboard instruments. The reason we know that is Suite number 5. He tried to write it out non-scordatura. So he tried to write it out in a way you play for keyboard. That means he's written some chords that cannot be played on a cello.
Right.
That one couldn't play with a properly tuned cello. So that's at least somebody in Bach's orbit who is using the cello suites at the keyboard. Many of Bach's students who were not string players seem to have known of the sonatas and partitas and the cello suites or known of them. So one gets the sense that Bach was trying to teach his students something like what you were just saying, this question of economy of means. How can you write a fugue like the from the prelude to the fifth suite that has almost no chords? So his strategy is one of economy of means. It's the opposite of what he does with the violin sonatas and partitas, which is how much can I get the solo violin to do nearly the kinds of things I could do on a keyboard? One gets the sense he really felt his understanding of what was possible on a cello with its fingerings or the larger stretches or whatever it may be led him to a much greater economy of means. And in that sense, it's maybe more like the solo flute partita, where of course
Yeah.
there are no double stops of any kind. And then for musicians in the 19th century, when the Bach's music was being revived, I think all of this was pretty remote for many of them. You know, musicians in Bach's orbit would have heard unaccompanied viol music, for example. There was a tradition of unaccompanied violin music they would be familiar with. Um, but for musicians starting from 1820, 1830, what were we to make of these pieces for solo cello? I think a lot of people found them to be curiosities that didn't sound like what they imagined Bach's music should. And yet, people were receiving this idea that Bach was the forerunner of all the great German music. So we were supposed to love it. But so one thing I've traced in my research is, well, what did critics make of it? Or what did critics say that audiences made of it? And it really runs the gamut from folks saying this is the most extraordinary music the cello has ever had, which is how many of us might think of it today, to others saying, well, the Allemande from the G major suite is nothing but scales and now and then a trill. That's word for word what one of the critics had to say about it. And yes, one of the solutions was to add piano accompaniment. Robert Schumann made a piano accompaniment for the sonatas and partitas, which was published. He made one for the cello suites because he said he thought he would bring it to more listeners. Maybe reading between the lines, maybe that's a way that he as a non-cellist could engage with this music, but maybe also he thought it's a way of updating the music to bring it to different listeners.
Yeah.
His version was never published, so it circulated in copies. It circulated as far as Australia, if you can believe it. There were
Huh.
performances of his version, yeah, in the 1870s in Australia. Um, and then another solution, Grützmacher produced two editions. One he called his original edition, which is more or less what Bach wrote. But his other version, his concert edition, it's like a Lisztian paraphrase or transcription that adds all kinds of chords, up bow staccato, recomposes it to make it more virtuosic, more exciting. And he got a tremendous response according to the reviews, even if it's sacrilegious by today's editorial or performance customs.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, there are ways in which even if that person, what they said about the Alaman from the first suite is true, that doesn't take away from its beauty. I mean, you could say that the Sarabande of the fifth suite is just a chord progression rolled in a particular way, a
Yeah.
short chord progression at that. It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, but it still moves people to
Right.
tears.
Yeah, the thing is, we have the benefit, all of us who learn these pieces learn them from people who knew them, who knew other people who knew them. And so it's sort of like generationally, we interpret this music in different ways and we build on what came before. But it's just so interesting to trace, people who might have heard or heard of, I don't know, the Matthew Passion. Maybe they knew some of the dense polyphony in the keyboard pieces. Maybe they knew some arias from some of the sacred music that was getting published. And then we have these cello suites must have been very puzzling because what is this as a genre, the solo cello? That wasn't something many people were familiar with. There was one review that said something like, well, clearly this music should never have left the classroom for the concert hall. Clearly it was intended just to learn how to play your instrument. So this might have been one of the motivating factors for many people to make arrangements that made these richer or made the harmony more explicit. These were often people were playing, one or two isolated movements in the middle of a concert program. It was Gritzmacher was the first, so far as we know, to play a complete suite regularly, probably usually playing his souped up version. There are recordings even as late as the 1920s that you can hear on YouTube. For instance, Julius Klengel, there's a recording of the Sarabande from the D major suite, and he plays it in a version. The piano part was made by someone named Schade, and he suggested maybe just play the melody. So the idea is to relieve the cellist of the obligation of rolling the chord. There was a lot of anxiety that the chord rolling distorted the rhythm. And maybe this conflicted with a 19th century aesthetic that the melody should be totally seamless and uninterrupted. I get that sense because many editions they shorten the chords or make the chords into grace notes. You get the sense that the editors were wanted to prioritize the melody and were concerned that bass notes would interrupt. So that was seemed to be an anxiety of some critics and some cellists in the 19th century.
Which is funny, isn't it? Because there, to my knowledge, there's been nowhere near the attempts to try to fix the chaconne from the D minor violin, and it has as many of these rolled chords that could keep you from hearing the dun 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 dun.
Mhm.
But that's wasn't
Yeah,
perceived as a problem there.
that's a good point. I haven't looked as closely at older editions of the sonatas and partitas. I think you will find some shortening of chords. So, when Bach writes a chord, he'll write four quarter notes with four separate stems. So every
Right.
note from the bass, right. But you'll see editions where they're shortened to 16th notes or to grace notes, or maybe it's a little bit trying to instruct you how to roll a four note chord. So, I mean, that's something people still think about today. I think many musicians today have been influenced with or without their knowledge by harpsichord players, where there's many kinds of way to roll a chord,
Mhm.
slow, fast, before the beat, on the beat, and that's an artistic resource. That's part of your possibilities. Certainly, cellists who've played a lot of bass lines know the bass line is really as important as the melody for making that counterpoint and giving shape to the phrase.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. Interesting. So, let's see. I'm want to keep on this idea of just even the cello or any instrument that is not a chordal instrument as an unaccompanied um as capable of playing something just kind of all by its lonesome, as it were. And I think I have to break this into two thoughts. The one is just so one of the classes I also enjoy teaching very much is orchestration. And it is interesting, for example, to play, let's say, Telemann fantasias for violin or for flute or even da gamba on cello. Like when I'm playing the flute ones, there are aspects of it that why a goodly percentage of it, the majority of it, would be every bit as appropriate on any number of instruments. And then every so often there'll be something that will be a little bit more flute idiomatic or something
Mhm.
like that. And so it's interesting, even from I think even um, like the book jacket information of your book talks a little bit about the idea of Bach not necessarily as a cello player, but orchestrationally almost exploring the capabilities of something that could go much, much lower than the violin. Um, but maybe he also uses kid gloves in that many of the suites are easier than their counterparts for violin. They're a little bit um, less chords, fewer chords for the most part. But I just wonder, did you look, for example, at the unaccompanied works for flute and compare their reception? Were they also early on thought of as etudes and not concert pieces?
That's a good question. I don't know the reception history of the flute partita as well. So, of course, over the course of the 19th century, there was a project to publish all of Bach's music. There was a lot of attention on, his major choral pieces, on his keyboard pieces. Um, I guess like the inspiration for that would be from the obituary that was written a few years after Bach died. There was a works list at the end of it, and it lists mostly keyboard and choral music. And then it mentions 6 solos for violin, 6 solos for cello, and then it says, and all kinds of instrumental pieces of every possible combination you could imagine. So, for whatever reason, the authors of the obituary, that's his student Agricola and his son C.P.E. Bach, they considered the unaccompanied violin and cello music to be exemplary music. Probably that reflects the importance that the composer attached to them. That's probably where they got that idea. I don't know why the solo flute piece wasn't mentioned in that same breath. But I suspect because of that obituary, people knew of the cello suites for a long time, even if they hadn't heard them, even if editions weren't available, even if they weren't yet widely known. That would be interesting to compare when did the flute partita get to be as well known as the cello suites. I suspect today there's still, flutists, of course, know them. Bach
Yeah.
experts know them. But the cello suites, they're used in all kinds of movies. They're used on television. The prelude to the G major suite, I've learned on Reddit, people call it that cello song. I read an Ask Me Anything event with Yo-Yo Ma from about 10 years ago. Someone asked him, why is that cello song used in all the movies? And without missing a beat, he knew which piece they meant. And
Right,
he was
right.
able to. So I'm not sure the flute partita, even to this day, has reached quite the same level of resonance. With the cello suites, they also have been used outside the concert hall quite a lot. I'm thinking of Rostropovich playing them at the fall of the Berlin Wall, more,
Yeah,
more
yeah.
recently Yo-Yo Ma playing them at the US-Mexico border. There's a children's book about that, for example. So I'm not sure one could say quite the same about the sonatas and partitas or the solo flute partita.
And the Telemann Fantasias for violin, flute, viola da gamba, did you run across them being kind of treated the same in that, oh,
Yeah,
these are things to learn your instrument?
that's a great question. I should look into that. I suspect it might be that some of Bach's music was received in a different way because of the idea of Bach and his greatness, or Bach as sort of the progenitor of the great German canon, might have meant people had different kinds of expectations of some of his music than they might have had for some of his contemporaries, is possible.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. All right. If you don't mind, I'd like to talk at least briefly about each of the 6 suites.
Sure.
So the first suite is, I think, the it's like there are certainly reasons why the prelude to the first became that cello song. So there's certain times when people will say about the cello suites as a whole that, okay, well, yes, the beret from the third suite is fairly well known and everything, but by and large, the prelude to the very first suite is what they're talking about. You know,
Hmm.
a lot of these people, they don't know thus and such a movement from the fourth suite or something like that. And so, I mean, the first suite is the simplest. It's the easiest to play. It's the shortest suite. But I think that prelude, in part, as we can go online and we can find videos about the 1 5 6 4 progression, the journey progression,
Hmm.
and how pervasive, okay, the Pachelbel's canon progression was underpinning, can be seen as the underpinning of a lot of these various pieces. And so there's a certain extent to which I wonder, you can find, for example, people using the first four bars of the prelude to the first suite to accompany the swan or you know what I mean? And then they change the chords as they go, but you just establish the key with this
Mhm.
very common sort of tonic, dominant preparation, dominant tonic progression. So in some ways, I always almost wonder if just the simplicity of the beginning of that prelude kind of made it Bach's equivalent of the journey progression, the don't stop believing progression. It's just ubiquitous.
Right. And maybe, what the C major prelude from Well Tempered Clavier Book One is for
Right.
Bach on the piano, this is for Bach on the cello. There's this wonderful website, whosampled.com, and you can look up any piece of music and people contribute who are pop musicians who've borrowed a riff from it or who have sampled it. It's really interesting to look that up for this prelude because it's all kinds of music. It's used in hip hop, in J-pop. There's a lot of pieces that cover it. There are jazz performances. There are guitar performances, including by some pretty famous pop guitarists.
Huh.
There have been choreographies made to it. So,
Yes.
this is a piece that's really touched a lot of people. So, on the one hand, this music is so abstract that it's sort of endlessly adaptable. It's been used in commercials ranging from diamonds to pizza to lazy boy furniture. On the other hand, it's very much a piece for the cello.
Yeah.
It's about as cello a piece as you could imagine. That doesn't mean you can't play it beautifully on the steel drum or marimba or whatever it might be, but you can tell from the way it's written and the way it features the open strings. On the Netflix series Wednesday, the recent Addams Family reboot, in the series premiere, there's that big scene where she's playing this big solo cello over a montage. If you look closely at the music, and Thing turns the pages for her, the music she has is this weathered copy of the prelude to the G major suite.
Nice. Okay, so I got to go back to what you just said. I mean, to my knowledge, there's not an instrument known to humans that doesn't also have somebody who's made a version of the prelude to the Bach cello suite for that instrument. And
Right.
it strikes me as a bizarre choice, this particular movement. Why not, for example, the beret from the third suite, da da dun, da da dun, dun da dun. That gives wind players a chance to breathe rather than this kind of perpetual motion style where you sneak in a breath where you can, but they're not built in.
Yeah.
But then, more importantly, the bariolage on the second page, where you end up playing, okay, the reason why these bariolage passages work is because the A on the D string sounds different from the open A. And here,
Right.
when you hear it on an instrument, any other instrument that where it's the exact same pitch, it doesn't make sense.
Right. What can I say? When people sometimes ask a question like, would Bach have preferred a Steinway Grand
Yeah,
over a
right.
harpsichord? It's an unanswerable question. But one thing I can at least say is he probably would have composed his music differently if he had had a different kind of instrument. How do we know that is when he transcribes his music
Yeah.
from one force to another, he takes advantage of what's idiomatic in the new force. So, there are movements from the violin sonatas and partitas that exist in orchestral versions in the cantatas, for example. The C minor suite number 5 exists in a version for lute in G minor, where there are some modifications made that probably reflect some of the idioms of the lute. So if Bach had composed this for a different instrument, he surely would have composed it differently. And we can trace the cello origin of this piece. It's not a piece that was written on keyboard and then arranged for cello. That's for sure. Um, should that stop someone from figuring out the way to play it on tenor saxophone and making it their own? I mean, how wonderful that this music exists in so many versions.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So in the case of the second suite, it's interesting to me how much the second suite seems to maybe with its moodiness or angst perceived that it appeals to a lot of teenage cellists, a lot of
Okay.
people. It's their favorite one to play. It's funny to me because the compared to the kind of the almost like well-tempered clavier, the perpetual motion type prelude, the second suite is really quite conceived very differently. And I think it's much harder to successfully interpret for especially audiences that aren't used to listening to unaccompanied instruments, because like the implied harmonies, the rolling out of the chords sometimes is a little bit more gradual.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's kind of funny. There's I would almost argue a little bit bigger of a gap between Suite 1 and 2 than between some of the other suites. And then also the in terms of the level of difficulty, the Courant and the Gigue are decidedly more advanced than anything in the first suite. But anyway, I'm just kind of like, as a violist, even, what are your thoughts about the second as opposed to the first?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've always tended to think of the prelude to the second suite as moody and introspective. One thing I discovered in my research that colored some of my understanding of where I had that impression from is I looked at the tempo markings in many 19th century editions, and many of them had quite quick tempi, like
Right.
yum bum bum, ba da da dee da da da, faster than I've ever heard anyone play. And then I got to Casal's recording. He didn't make an edition. And okay, that is quite slow. And it occurred to me, most of my teachers studied with people who studied with people who, if not studied with Casals, were inspired by him or listened. So I think quite a lot of us, whether directly or indirectly, it's interesting to think about how our conceptions of some of these pieces are refracted through the imagination and influence of a kind of small handful of particular musicians is interesting. Um, what else to say? In my book, I talk about the preludes as having sort of two types. I describe them as either through composed or as being pattern preludes or modified pattern preludes. So by pattern prelude, I mean something like the G major, where much of at least the first page introduces a pattern and follows it. Maybe there's some sections that are a little freer. The fourth cello suite would be another example. The D minor would definitely be a through composed one where there's this head motive, yom, bum, bum, which comes back almost in the manner of a ritornello to mark different arrivals and F
Mm.
major in other places. And in between, the music has this sort of wandering quality where we're trying to get a sense, okay, well, which key is going to come next? And oh, now it is going to be F major. Oh, we're free from the shackles of minor and heading toward the brightness of major is sort of the story one can trace with these. The D minor suite, another interesting thing about it for me is it's one of those suites where you can really tell that several movements of the suite fit together as a family. By that, I mean, toward the end of the prelude, there's this motive E flat, D, C sharp, and we get it in several different octaves, um, leading into the chords at the very end. You get the high E flat, D, those chords. Um, and then in the Gigue from the same suite, we also get the same thing with an emphasis on E flat, which is kind of a callback or the idea that this prelude and this Gigue were clearly composed as a pair with their emphasis on the Neapolitan harmony on E flat.
Yeah, yeah. The like the prelude of the second suite is more like the prelude of a fantasia, in some that's the through
Yeah.
composed ones. Um, yeah. Do you find the third and the sixth trickier when if you're teaching the third the courant or the gigue of the second suite, that they're decidedly require more advanced player than anything that's required in the first suite?
I remember having to practice them a lot when I learned them, so that sounds right. It might be on viola, some of the things that are challenging play out in a little bit different ways than on cello. I'm mindful that I'm gesturing the viola version, even though your audience are mostly cellists, so I hope that's not sacrilegious for anyone. But
No, no, no.
yeah.
It's funny because even just the strings being the opposite direction make
Mhm.
a string crossing pattern, you know, feel different.
And then
And then
another thing I tell cellists is, I learned in the course of my research that many cellists in Bach's orbit would have played with the underhand bow hold, what we think of as
mm,
the gamba bow hold rather than the overhand. So that also would make string,
right,
the idea of, okay, so the strong stroke is the up
right.
rather than
Yeah.
the down. That must make some of the crossings play out in a really different way than how most modern cellists play today.
Very true, very true. So then the third suite, the heroic suite in my mind, I give them all personality names when I introduce them to students. But the third suite, that prelude is a very popular one among youngsters. I find myself doing master classes on that prelude quite a bit, for example. And again, it's another one that I think has enormous artistic merit, but also is extremely valuable from an etude, from a technical, what it teaches if
Hmm.
you're paying attention. And then, of course, the beret of that suite is the most famous one from by virtue, I think, of the
Hmm.
Suzuki books. Um, but it definitely it continues its at least by the tempos that I play, it's just that much longer and in some respects that much more challenging to play accurately and well than the second suite.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, any are there things as a violist that make the third suite distinct from the first two?
Yeah. Well, certainly in the prelude, we have the climax over the dominant pedal and the question of how to bow it. So many of the sources, if I'm remembering correctly, have like a 3-and-1 kind of which today I think is how many Baroque players play. I think a lot of modern players do some kind of slurred dee da tee da 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 tee da, something like
Right.
that. Um, this is one of those passages where the left hand is playing quarterly, but the right hand is playing in a broken way. So that's kind of interesting to think of and to practice this music as chords. We have a beautiful chain of suspensions. So what is it? F E. I can't really sing the suspensions. C B A B. B A.
Yeah.
So you really feel the seconds, at least when we finger them on viola, you feel that though between 1 and 4. Probably on cello, you must be similar.
Yeah.
Um,
With
so
thumb.
that must be a thumb, of course. So that must be a big stretch,
Yeah.
of course. This is another one where there's that sense of family resemblance among the movements. So, dim ba da dee da 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 dee da 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 dum. Yum
Yeah.
bum bum bee da da dum bum ba da da dum bum bim ba da dum bum bum. Yeah, ba, 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 ba. So clearly, the openings of these movements have some relationship to one another. I used to think that was an anachronistic idea. If I'm talking about how all the movements fit together, that was something that became really important to 19th century musicians. We see it a lot in Brahms music. This organicism. But in my research, I found many people in Bach's orbit who expressed something similar. So North German contemporary of Bach saying that the first movement of a suite is like the proposition from which everything that follows flows. Or the English lutenist Thomas Mace, he wrote a treatise 1670, something like that, and he says the movements of a suite should have something of a kin, that they should resemble one another, that they should be like a family. And there seem to be movements, suites by Bach, where you really detect that relationship. And then the Gigue, yum bum, ba da 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 dum bum bum, probably that ascending scale. Maybe that's the heroic version, as you say, the counterpart to the precipitous descending scale. And then the other thing we have is in Peter Kellner's manuscript copy, that's source B, the tempo marking presto. So we don't know his source for that. He was copying from a source that was written by someone who was connected to Bach. So could that have been a presto marking Bach could have written in the exemplar for Kellner's source, or was that just Kellner's idea? We don't have a way of knowing, but that's interesting to think. Well, what if this were presto? How fast would that be, or what character, what gesture would that inspire us to consider?
Yeah. Interesting. So then the first three, in many respects, I think, are uh, more widely known. Again, except the five has the lute version, but four is maybe the least well known and the least often played. And the thing I hear most about it is, well, I guess it's two things, but they both just relate to the key. That the key is supposedly much harder to make the instrument sound good because of the sympathetic vibration of the strings or lack thereof. And then also the key requiring more extensions or pivots of the hand and thus being more taxing for the left hand. And I've heard more than once in my life cellist, not an amateur cellist, say that the fourth suite is the most difficult. which
Mm.
I mean, I think it's a crazy thing to say when you're playing through the sixth suite and wishing you had a fifth string. But
Right.
it is funny too because there are times when I'll find if I have a student who is being very, well, I don't want to go, but it's like there's certain clampy ways to use your left hand that the E flat suite is going to break you of the habit of. I mean, you can't, you don't have the endurance to do it in a way that is unhealthy. It forces you to find a way to be balanced in all these positions that are not necessarily just the closed position that we get used to in C major or G major.
Hmm.
But the other thing about the E flat suite, I mean, I think there are ways, just one other thought here, I'll bounce off you as well. Whenever I have a cello player who is at all tempted to drift. Like sometimes as a freshman, they come in and you ask them for an F sharp minor scale, and it slightly becomes G major by the end. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It wants to move to a key that rings better. And I love in those situations to have somebody play even just a movement from the E flat suite, and then also something E majory. Often I'll pick like one of the Telemann like there's a Telemann, one of the flute pieces in E major, and so that you can kind of, like they would have in the Baroque period, have thought of the key characteristics. You know, kind of
Hmm.
love the warmth or whatever word you choose to use of E flat major versus the aggressiveness or brittleness of E major and lean into that. And
Hmm.
so, I mean, I think some people, I think some on some recordings, I'll go through and I'll listen to all of their suites, and I'll think that they actually sound the most resonant on the fourth suite, not the
Mm.
least. I
Okay.
don't know if that's just me.
Um, I also find intonation a challenge in this suite. It's interesting, in the cello suites, as much as I love how they sound on viola, I often am jealous of the depth cellists can achieve, and that's a challenge or a frustration for me playing these on viola. But the one thing that is easier on viola is we don't have to shift from low E flat to high E flat. That's just
And
in
now I'm
position for us.
jealous.
Right. Now, I don't know exactly what size or type of cello Bach might have had in mind. There are surviving instruments and pictures of instruments you can see of things that look like a modern cello, but that are smaller, that people propped them up. Could there have been an instrument he might have had that wouldn't have required quite so much shifting? There are folks who say, aha, this suite is the evidence that these pieces were originally written for viola or viola da spalla. Maybe, I don't know. Or maybe he wanted someone to master that shifting as modern cellists do. I think another challenge besides all, well, first of all, also with the tuning, the idea that not only are the tonic and dominant not open strings, but also then like the median, so G and the leading tone D, you need to find your E flat based on what makes a good third, find your B flat. So that I find that tricky to find exactly where the tonic should lie for those. But then besides all those technical and resonance challenges, there's also the challenge of making music, meaning you can hear performances where every measure sounds sort of the same.
Yeah.
And one thing I do with the E flat suite in my book is I encourage people to consider playing it at the keyboard and to just get rid of all the string crossings for a minute and just listen to the bass line. A bass line starts with an E flat pedal and then has a scale. Da, da, dee, da, 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 da. If you were playing just that bass line at that tempo, obviously you can't play the prelude at that tempo, but you'd shape it a certain way. The idea that an entire measure of Bach's prelude might represent a passing tone in the bass. That's then maybe I don't need to take time on every downbeat,
Yes.
as some people might be in the habit of doing. Um, Carl Schachter, whom I mentioned earlier, has a lovely article about that prelude, which I gloss on a little bit here. He talks about the D flat early in the prelude and its relationship to the C sharp at the bottom of the first page.
Oh.
That there's kind of a story about D flat turns into C sharp. Sharp in German, the word is Kreuz, which also means cross. And Bach sometimes uses sharps, conspicuous sharps that have possibly some religious resonance. In that case, that C sharp is the moment where the pattern breaks down. So it represents a kind of catastrophe. And then we have these composed cadenzas that try to bring the piece back together, help it find its way to the G minor cadence that we know is coming, but it takes a lot of effort to get there. So there's a whole story of this prelude that I like to try to experience when I'm playing or when I'm coaching it. Sometimes we get a little lost in all the technical challenges because they are considerable.
They are. They are. Yeah, this is a really profound suite, as is the fifth suite. And the two most striking things about the fifth suite that I always harp on a lot with my students, the one is that we do also have the version for lute, which is it's great to look at, it's great for
Mhm.
score study purposes, and it's also great to hear people play it uh, on guitar, on lute, and see the wheels turn on a cellist in terms of how, wait, our gut way to play that would be this. And if you're just on a, if you're just strumming it, you don't necessarily make as big of a deal, or vice versa in some cases. Anyway, that's one of the fascinating things, is the comparison. And then the biggest, of course, is that it just is the one that's in the French style,
Yeah.
which highly impacts all six of the movements. And so it's kind of its own world in that respect. So it's like I emphasize the score study and everything, and then okay, well, also you're turning your A string down to a G, and
Mhm.
now I think the effect of decreasing the tension of just one of the strings really makes just about any cello sound enough darker that it sounds like it's a big viola to my
Mhm.
ear. When you tune a string down, I mean, I even kind of think that way about the um Kodai sonata, when we take a little bit of tension off by lowering the G string and the C string by half a step,
Mhm.
and now it's just somehow the sound is a little bit darker still. And to me, it sounds like we're a basso viola.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there are some guitarists. I'm thinking of a musician like Joni Mitchell, where almost every one of her songs, the guitar is tuned differently.
Mm,
Heinrich Ignaz Bieber, a lot of his violin music, there's so
yeah,
many different tunings. And most of us today are really not used to playing these instruments with so many different tunings. So it can be very defamiliarizing. But boy, does it afford new possibilities. The idea of having a chord GDG with three open strings is such a wonderful sound. In the gavots, where you have the and you have the unison with G and G, which is
yeah.
something you have in a lot of French music. It's a big part of viol playing that Bach is imitating here. I remember as a child, the first recordings I listened to are what you might describe as more romantic interpretations.
Yeah.
For violas, we have Lillian Fuchs, who made these fantastic recordings not too long after Casals made his. And, she would play, if I'm remembering right, the Allemande, very singing. And then when I first heard a Baroque performance, I just couldn't believe it. But I've come to appreciate, well, boy, does that really make the music sound a la breve. It really sounds like it's in two rather than in four. And I mean, it's wonderful. We have over 300 recordings of these pieces. Many of us live with them over the course of our lifetime. You can do it different ways at different stages of your life, depending what you want to explore in this music. I play on both modern and on Baroque viola. I do some things differently depending on the
Yeah.
the instrument.
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned before the Sarabande from the C minor suite. I just want to highlight this because I think this might be the only movement with zero double stops of any kind. I think it
Hmm.
is the shortest movement in terms of number of measures and number of notes. Very, very austere. If I'm remembering right, I think there's a video with Casals in a masterclass where he compares it to the crucifixion.
Oh,
There's been this tendency for folks to, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, this is secular music that Bach wrote in Köthen when he was not focusing on religious music. On the other hand, there's been this tendency for folks to project possible religious interpretations onto it. Stephen Isserlis's book has a reading of all six cello suites in terms of the life of Christ. And for folks who hear the austerity of the C minor suite as having something to do with crucifixion, maybe then the ebullience and the ring and the brilliance of the sixth suite might be something connected to resurrection, is a comparison some have made.
Wow, wow. Boy, there's always more, isn't there? You just
Right.
Yes, and so then the sixth suite, oh, I had know of a couple people who I could facetiously call them cheaters who have a five string instrument. And
Hmm.
I mean it's just like I don't know. When once you've taken the trouble to learn how to navigate all of the notes on merely four strings, it seems like it almost takes some of the fun out of it by having the fifth string and just kind of like, hey, look at me. I don't even have to shift for this passage. And here you're coming in all these contorted fingerings to try to make passages work without the fifth string. But even I mean, I don't know. Just in some ways, with four strings or with five strings, the sixth suite seems the most like it. I mean, it's in its right place as the last of the six. It's the pinnacle
Yeah.
of them
Hmm.
because there are a number of ways in which he seems most comfortable with the instrument by that point.
Yeah.
Just the enormous variety when you think about what he's asking for example, in the Allemande of that suite, compared to the techniques and the aesthetic of the other movements, is more variety, it
Hmm.
seems. I mean, they still clearly go together, but it's an enormous world all in one suite.
Yeah. Yes, those long florid melodies in the Allemande and to some extent in the Sarabande. Yeah, I mean, I have the sense well, I've never played it on a five-string instrument, and then I have a confession. I cheat in a different way. Many violas play it in G major
Yeah.
because we don't have thumb position, and so there are some violas who have played it, as written in D major on four strings. Lillian Fuchs mostly plays it in D major. There's an American violist living in the UK named Scott Slapin who's made a recording on YouTube in D major like this. That's very impressive to develop that sort of fluency in that register. Um, and same when I watch cellists who really mastered what's involved with the thumb position. Um, what can I say? It's clear that Bach conceived this for a five-string instrument and that it's in some sense more idiomatic, but I can also understand for someone who's spent that time to learn this piece in thumb position that must yeah, feel like some sort of cheating. I can understand that. I was able to track down who I think is the first cellist to revive the performance of this on a five-string instrument. It was a Dutch cellist who was principal of the Concertgebouw named Henry Bosmans, who
Okay.
in 1893 he commissioned a five-string cello. People had long known that this music was for five-string cello, but it doesn't appear that folks had actually tried it, and the reviews were mixed. The reviews said he played beautifully, but that they didn't think this would catch on because the review said it sounds like a baritone singer who has somehow found a way to reproduce tenor notes. That it didn't sound like what he expected in a cello sound is what I get from that review.
Huh.
But
That's
yes, then some of the first recordings on Baroque instruments, folks were thinking, well, if we're trying to revive what Bach intended, or if that's what people
yeah.
thought of themselves as doing, that included then using five-string instruments. And I think quite a lot of Baroque players who record this music will do this on a five-string.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. Wow. Well, I think these suites are certainly here to stay. And the fact that they have borne, like you say, just hundreds of recordings and over 100 editions,
Yes.
and then let alone the number of other instruments that want to play them on their instrument as well. Um, it's great. I'm very glad you did this book. It's like there is sometimes when a student of mine is, whether it's their idea or mine, get started on a movement of a Bach suite, I mean, I kind of have to suppress a smile because it's a big can of worms. And so it's like gradually introducing them to, okay, here are the facsimiles of these five original,
Right.
and then after that, okay, here are the Alan Winold where he's gone to the trouble to write the Roman numerals under everything, and now, I mean, and there's of course the historical contextual one. I'm very glad that you went through and did this research to write this book, which I mean had to have been a lot of fun in doing. But I also imagine the way that research works, where it often almost creates more questions as it goes than it answers. So, what's next for you? Do you have other projects that you're either started on already or dying to get to? Um, Actually, whether or not they relate to Bach or the Bach suites.
Right. Well, thank you. I hope this is a book that many cellists and people who enjoy hearing the cello suites will find helpful. And unlike some other resources you might have encountered, I really tried to be neutral and factual. So just a guide to what are questions you may have had, or you might have had one teacher who said this and another said that, or this edition says this says that. I try to walk folks through what is knowable and where do we have to get into the world of guesswork or preference. And I've tried to do it in a way that uses a minimum amount of jargon. So it's a book that you really could read in a weekend if you'd like to, or you can flip through the index and find the part that relates to the piece that you're playing now. And I try to trace these pieces. What did they mean in Bach's lifetime? What did they mean to musicians in the 19th century, where there was a lot more there than I expected to find? Many, many, many more performances by cellists you've heard of and by cellists you might not have heard of. Many names that come to mind in the history of the Bach cello suites are German men. So I was really looking for people who were not German or who were not men who were part of this story. How did the way we play them change over time? So that includes, for instance, when did people begin giving concerts where they'd play all six suites, and what did
Yeah.
audiences make of those? There were some questions I couldn't quite get to the bottom of in the book, and so that's some work I might like to turn to next as I'm able. So one question I'm curious about. So we've all heard of this idea and are familiar with the narrative of Pablo Casal's discovering the cello suites as a teenager. And on the one hand, that's always struck me as tricky because, well, there were many editions, so someone must have been playing them before Casals began playing them. He says that he studied them on his own for about a dozen years before he started playing them in public in the early 1900s. One thing I'm curious to understand a little better is um, how is it that he or people in his orbit hadn't heard of these pieces when there were so many performances happening in Germany, in France, even as far away as Australia? So I haven't dug as much into the Spain or Catalan context. But also, the first edition he came in contact with was that Grützmacher recomposed edition, Grützmacher's concert edition. So I've seen a facsimile of this edition. And it's very different from what Bach wrote. So one unknown question is, when did Casals get access to more reliable editions, and what was his history during that decade when he says he was studying them? And one thing that's interesting about Casals is he and some people in his orbit, starting around the 50s, there's a lot of references to the way the purists play versus the way he played. Sometimes they would even say the German purists. And one gets the sense that Casals wanted to separate himself from a tradition of mostly German editors of the cello suites. And that probably has something to do with his music making, things he did differently from maybe Klengel or others. But it probably also has something to do with politics, because Casals was famously anti-fascist, and these were the
Mhm.
years around World War II. So that's something I'd like to explore in a little more depth. I'm also interested, speaking of Casals, the edition by Diran Alexandrian, which probably some of your listeners have seen. So Casals famously refused to make an edition. He didn't believe that you could play the piece the same way twice. And he didn't
Yeah.
want, he said, I look at nothing but Anna Magdalena's manuscript. He probably played these pieces mostly from memory because he played them every day for
Right.
decades. So the Alexandrian edition, you could think of it as a performance edition. It has fingerings and this sort of stuff, but you could also think of it as a kind of an analysis, that it's a publication that's meant to communicate ideas about voicing, ideas about kind of abstract ideas about how this music is ordered. And I thought it could be interesting to read that edition in connection with what other music theorists around the same time are writing. Something of a name that you will know, but your listeners may not. Ernst Kort, who was interested in this idea of energetics, interested in the way melodies have shapes toward climaxes. And he used unaccompanied Bach quite a lot to demonstrate this. He was an amateur cellist himself and produced an edition of the Cello Suites. And also writings by Heinrich Schenker around the same time include references to the Cello Suites that might be interesting to put in dialogue with that edition by Alexanian, because they're both interested in how do we represent abstract ideas of voice leading that are sort of beneath the surface of what's literally there on the page.
Yeah, nice. And the Werner Thomas Mifune version that has the black note heads or the blue note heads. Are you familiar with
I don't
that?
know that one. No, tell me about that.
Yeah, his edition, it came out maybe I want to say at least 20 years ago,
Hmm,
and every movement of every suite, every note head is either black or blue based
hmm,
on whether he thinks of it as the lower voice or the upper voice.
right.
And there's a number of them where crystal clear. Like it's hard to imagine anybody arguing. But then a lot of the ones where it gradually passes the baton from the upper to the lower voice. It's fun having my students, for example, go, okay, now play through this and read his and pick a bar to maybe disagree, you
Yeah.
know? So that might be an interesting comparison too.
Yeah, there have been a number of published analyses. So you mentioned Alan Winold. There's also David Ledbetter's book, Bach's Unaccompanied Music. This edition that you just mentioned, which I'll have to take a look at. If you get three music theorists analyzing a piece in a room, they will have different perspectives, as they should. And this music is complex, so there's a lot to look at. But I think that's a lot of the interest in it. For me, because I play a little piano, I enjoy playing this music at the keyboard and thinking about, okay, well, which notes really go in my left hand? And
Hmm.
which is the melody. And maybe if there's only two notes, well, what would be the third or the fourth note that would complete the harmony? In some movements, like the saraband from the C minor suite, da 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 da. Okay, that's clearly a C minor chord. Dom, A flat. What is that A flat
Yeah,
doing there?
right.
Does
How do
that
you
mean this
harmonize that?
bar is A flat C, E flat G? Well, that can't be the first chord of the piece. So it's not straightforward music in that respect. And I applaud anybody who publishes an analysis because it's sort of like throwing meat to the wolves.
Right.
Of course, someone will disagree and have a different angle. That's something I thought about in writing my book. Is I tried mostly to keep the analyses to things that probably many of us could agree on. And to leave some of the thornier questions for people to chew over using their preferred method and their preferred vocabulary for it.
Nice, nice. Wow. Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you and going deep into this wonderful repertoire. And again, more power to you. And I look forward to seeing where your next research and progress projects take you as well.
Thanks so much for having me as an interloper on your cello podcast. I like to think that violas and cellos can be friends too, and the cello suites. What
Right.
better topic for us to chew on together? Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. And everybody out there, happy practicing all week. We'll meet back here at this same time next week. Take care.
You had me at Jello.